Blue for boys, pink for girls. For many, that's an outdated way of thinking. Gender neutrality is now a growing trend in fashion.
A California bill would require department stores to maintain gender-neutral sections for kids.
The world's first gender-neutral clothing store has officially opened in New York City.
Now, interestingly, this isn't just going to be about clothes. It's also going to have to do with the makeup section and literally everything that they're doing in the store.
I don't know, it's crazy right now, especially with like the millennials, and they're very entitled and they want to kind of choose everything, you know, including their gender.
It would be nice if I didn't have to feel like I was doing some sort of clandestine activity by shopping in the men's section.
As far back as I can remember, I never really saw clothing, like, personally, I never saw clothing as a gendered thing.
I've always been really flamboyant in my dress. I've just put in earrings and put my hair up and use different types of barrettes and colors and things like that. And I that just doesn't seem to be available for non-binary unless we call it something else. I don't know. So I just hope that that's what we're moving towards.
I was raised in a very nebulously defined world as far as fashion and gender were concerned. There were famous people from the 70s and the 80s who dressed with, big hair and colorful clothes and makeup, and it just wasn't a big deal in my family that, you know, girls should dress very girly and guys should dress very guyly.
Katie Lang, I think, was the first person I thought had gender neutral clothing, where it removes gender neutral. I think of it as hiding whether somebody was born AMAB or AFAB. I think of bow ties, lots of bow ties. I don't know what it is with gender neutral clothing and bow ties, but every store that sells gender neutral clothing has to have a good selection of bow ties. So that's what I think of as well.
When I think about gender neutral fashion, I think about two basic types. So you have the neutral by design, which is the more futuristic, the one size fits all, unisex, basically jumpsuit or t-shirt and track pants is what it comes out looking like, with varying degrees of sleeve length or leg length. But it's meant to basically look the same. Like, it'll come in small, medium, large, but it will essentially drape on the figure the exact same no matter who wears it. Whereas you have neutral by modeling, which is where you have your standard fashion, which is, your basic male, female. So your camo, your cargo pants, your big boots, your leather jackets on the men's side. And then on the ladies' side, you have the floral patterns, the dresses, the pastels, the heels, that sort of thing. And when you mix them together on the same model, you can create a contrasting effect where the overall presentation becomes neutral because of the weighing of the two aspects. Where this ends up presenting most in fashion photography, they usually try and use an androgynous model so that the model's base read doesn't show one way or another. Otherwise, they have to kind of pile on more clothing of the other type in order to counteract that, which is why you end up seeing a lot of the more feminine looking models being thrown into more male as default looking fashion, such as, the blazers, the suit combos, stuff like that, because you are specifically having to offset the underlying feminine read on the model in order to make it appear more neutral.
When I first came across gender neutral clothing, it was called unisex.
From an early age, I saw my parents working together and essentially wearing the exact same uniform. It was literally the same khaki shirt with the business name stitched into it from my mom's sewing machine, and then the same pair of blue jeans, the same black leather or brown leather belt, and they had like 7 pairs of the same shirt and same pants for their work attire, and they were working a lot. So I never really got that whole concept, at least from my parents, that there was a way that the daddies dress and a way that the mommies dress.
It was something my mom said, it's unisex. Both your sister and you can wear it. It's like, and I think she was trying to talk me into it by saying it's all the rage, my mom. But I didn't care actually at that age. And all through my life, I just simply didn't care. I was kind of happy to get that kind of clothing. So, I came of age throughout the 70s, and then I was a teenager in the 80s, sort of. So, and if you look back at sort of gender neutral clothing, I guess back then it was, or there wasn't such a term. It was unisex, and assigned male at birth, people who presented as males still wore short shorts, and they just let it show. They could shave their legs or not. That's when we started doing that. So I guess it was the French cut jeans and all of that sort of low cut jeans, high cut jeans. It was everyone could wear that stuff. It didn't seem there was a men's and women's jeans. There was men, women, and unisex.
I got a lot of 70s hand-me-downs, which I don't know if a lot of people, when they think of 70s fashion, it is very gender neutral. It's all very, bright colors or very like long, the long bell-bottom pants or the bright windbreaker jackets, which pretty much any kid would be in the same bright windbreaker jacket because it's easy to spot the kid in the crowd that way. So I grew up wearing a lot of, shorts, t-shirts, what people would assume is basic tomboy or regular boy kid clothes. And I enjoyed that as a presentation and enjoyed the label of tomboy that came along with it. I didn't know why until later on, but that's a story for another day.
I would just always kind of move towards the unisex, and I wish that kind of got moved into what gender neutral is today.
Shopping is a mixed bag.
I get a little bit discouraged by it because my history is about, I'm okay displaying sort of a more of my body and self, and I find that most gender neutral clothing seems to be clothing that was for AMAB people who are assigned male at birth, just re-stitched to fit people who are assigned female at birth, so that it's really just sort of a men's clothing. And I love the term androgynous and androgyny. It's just my age. It's where I come from, and that's what we kind of called gender neutral, I guess, at the time, before we moved gender and sex away from each other. So I think of gender neutral clothing more along the lines of, approaching each other's sexuality that each other's binary would wear in order to neutralize and make more ambiguous what the assigned sex was. For me, it was just, I can just wear a shirt and a bow tie. It's like, I don't need to go gender neutral shopping, because that's sort of what it is.
The smaller stores are very gendered. You get a lot of stores that are geared towards, women, or stores that are geared towards men. Or if you go to bigger chain stores, you end up with whole sections within them that are geared towards one gender or the other. And so you're basically forced to pick and choose what presentation you're going to shop for at any given time. unless you want to wander all over a very massive kind of department store looking for a little bit of everything. And even within the stores, the staff themselves end up being gendered more often than not, which I think is a very interesting thing because it's clothing, and you'd think that anyone who is wearing it would be able to sell it. So you kind of get this whole disconnect when you're shopping, at least in person. When you start shopping online, obviously you don't have to worry so much about staff. You don't have to worry so much about the presentation of the whole store, unless you're looking for that kind of variety, and then you want to obviously look for stores that have more of a variety of gender in the clothing. When you're shopping, one thing you really have to keep in mind is that what you see on catalogs on models has been tailored to the model for that shoot. So what you're getting is not necessarily right out of the box, right off the shelf, going to fit you the same way as it did in the advertisement.
I have a lot of millennial mentors because I think they're right. I'm right on the cusp of being a boomer, and I think I hate most of what boomers say because I really actually when they say we have capitalism sucks and all that stuff, they actually are right.
A lot of prominent figures in society have done a lot of work to erase and ignore the history behind gender non-conforming people and presentation. There was that period of time where gender presentation was very strictly enforced, and it was very looked down upon to deviate in any way from a specific dictated presentation. So as far as it being anything new or modern or futuristic, no. There have been, gender neutral people for a long time, and there will continue to be gender neutral people for a very long time.
Have you read Thomas Kuhn's at all? He's a bit of a philosopher. He writes books. He wrote one called "The Structure of." I got it written down. Structure of Scientific Revelations. Now I read it so long ago. I just call it the Philosophy of Science book. But it's about he's arguably coined the phrase the paradigm shift. So you can look at any sort of big discovery back in time where nobody really believed it, like the Earth was round. A lot of people probably didn't believe that at the time, and I think heads were getting lopped off or something like that. But there's a lot of people I think that hated that, and I think that's what's happened here. And then, in fact, gender and sexuality and all of that got separated, and then it started and they figured this out in I think the mid 90s or late 90s, and then they started to teach it in school, and millennials have gone through that school system and are coming out and looking at what everyone generationists and boomers and all that sort of stuff and saying, oh, you guys are totally wrong. So again, here they are, they're right. And so I think we just have to have that paradigm shift, which means everybody has to be taught the same thing about, and it's a scientific discovery that science is working on and moving forward and trying to educate the world around.
Humans are very visual creatures, and we are also very judgmental creatures. That's two of the things that have helped us become apex, the top of the chain, so to speak, is because of the snap judgments and the visual cues that we are able to pick up on and give off and relate with one another. I think that there is a lot to be said for kind of taking a step back from that now that we have become kind of the best of the best, and realize that there's room for us to expand on what we classify as certain things, and to realize that you can't always, tell from a snap judgment anymore. And we never really could.
I watched this video. I think it's called "Pluto Isn't a Planet and Trans Women Are Women" or something like that. I don't know if you've seen that video. It's on YouTube. You could look it up, and it's really well explains how we create these categories. It's up to us to call something something. So if we want non-binary and in all of the different in all the different, what do you call it, styles, then we can just do that. I mean, we don't have to go by what something was written biblically or something like that.
Fashion itself is very fluid. Um, the concept of gender in fashion is very fluid. Pink and blue have shifted over time between what gender they were associated with. Heels, skirts. There was a point in time where every kid up to a certain age wore those little white dresses, and kids' fashion was gender neutral for a very long period of time.
I really hope it's not just, somebody like, Reebok or Mariposa or something like that, just relabeling clothing, which seems to be what's happening. Everybody jumps on that bandwagon and, I guess what you would call it, gender wash it. Like they're just trying to be inclusive, I guess. And I hope we move past that, because that seems to be what's happening now a little bit. And that we truly come up with a lot of different varieties, as many varieties as there are non-binary people. Because I think non-binary people, some want to be, non-binary femme, which is where I was heading, but it was really difficult to be seen as that. And then, and there's non-binary masculine people. And I think we need to be able to provide clothing for all, not just a few.
I really see gender neutral fashion being more bold, more accessible, more personal, more unashamed, and just letting people really get a hold and have the ability to experiment and have access to and be allowed to wear fashion that was previously withheld from them. Because I don't think fashion should be necessarily withheld from anyone. I think you should be allowed to experiment with what you put on your body and what you feel comfortable putting on your body.
I think that's the future.
Gender neutral fashion is
fashion that either combines styles that are considered to be stereotypically feminine with styles that are considered more masculine, or I think of clothing that strives to be entirely free of gender markers and doesn't signify either a feminine or a masculine aspect.
Not necessarily a cross between what normal society would consider masculine or feminine. I think it's somewhere in between. I do think there can be certain aspects of your clothing that can, either fit masculine or feminine, but in my style, I'm very neutral. I don't really have a side that I necessarily pick.
Clothing, jewelry that doesn't necessarily fit with society's prescribed ideas of femininity and masculinity.
When I dress myself in a gender neutral way, I tend to opt more for the former definition. So like opting for pieces that are quite masculine and pairing them with pieces that are a bit more femme or very floral and bright. Mainly because I've found that fashion that's specifically designed to be androgynous is really inaccessible, and it's made by fashion lines that are very costly and designer and aren't accessible for a student like me.
like typical stores that probably people of my age go to that are more female presenting are like H&M or, you know, Aritzia or whatnot. And whenever I go in there, I just can never find clothes that I feel like I would be comfortable in. Not that I don't think that they're cute, but I just wouldn't wear them. So like, but when I walk into like a male's clothing store, I usually end up finding things that I like, but don't fit me or my body type. They're more fit for men. So it's been kind of difficult.
My experiences shopping for gender-neutral fashion since I moved to Victoria have been very good because I have access to a lot of thrift stores, and I really appreciate thrift store spaces because they're far less gendered than malls or other spaces where you buy new clothes. Generally, the men's clothing section is right next to the women's clothing section, and there isn't any gendered advertising about like how women are supposed to look or how men are supposed to look, or specific clothing items on exclusively male or female bodies. So it feels like it's a space where it's much freer for you to shop in between sections and try on clothing from all areas of the store. It's also been great because I can buy pieces for a very low cost. So if it feels like a little bit of a fashion risk or I'm like trying something new, it won't cost me financially.
Most of the time, I'll be shopping in the men's section just because I like the way it looks and feels on me personally. But I like to look for stuff that's not super, like, I don't want to say one way or the other because it's like, I don't like the fact that clothing is so gendered because it shouldn't be. I mean, clothes don't have X and Y chromosomes, but it's all in how society perceives us and what we wear and how we look and how we present ourselves.
I have like the flannel. I know that's kind of typical, kind of stereotype LGBTQIA+, but, you know, I think it really does represent me in like a big sweater, baggy clothing, things that don't necessarily show off whether I have a masculine or female presenting body, things that don't necessarily pop out to you as, oh, they're really feminine or, oh, they're really masculine. So just very standard, plain kind of clothing.
The outfit that I'm wearing today is a pair of overalls that were made for men combined with a print shirt that was from the women's section. And it's one of my favorite gender neutral outfits because I find that it has a silhouette that would be considered more masculine, which makes me comfortable. I'm genderqueer and I tend to prefer having a more masculine silhouette, but I also love bright prints. So I often throw in some bright prints into all of my outfits, which make them look a little bit more androgynous and bring in color that often can't be found in clothing marketed towards men.
Well, I really like this shirt. It's super fun, and I think it's fairly gender neutral because, I mean, if you just look at it, you're not immediately going to go, oh, that's like a women's shirt, or oh, that's a man's shirt. I don't even remember where I got this. I think it was probably a hand-me-down. But it's super comfy, and it's got like the nice button-down action going, and it's fairly neutral as an outfit goes, and a lot of what I wear sort of more goes along these lines.
I hope that gender neutral fashion will be considered more mainstream.
I hope that particularly for men and masculine presenting people, it will be more socially acceptable for them to wear more gender neutral fashion, because we, at least in our Western society, live in a patriarchal and often very sexist society. And it's good to note that sexism affects not just women and like non-binary people, but men as well. And it can prevent them from like pursuing avenues of fashion and design that they might be interested in. Like, we see that it's generally become more acceptable for like a woman to wear a suit because masculine traits are valued in our society, but it's still not as acceptable for like a man to wear a dress. And like if there's ever like a celebrity who wears a dress, it's like headline news, everyone's talking about it. And I don't think that it should be as huge of a deal as people are making it out to be, because it's, I don't want to say it's just clothing, because nothing is ever just what it appears on the outside, because we live in a society. But I think that it should become more socially acceptable for people to just wear whatever they want to wear, and for just the binary to be not necessarily dealt away with, because gender is very important to a lot of people, but the roles and expectations that come with the binary should be softened.
I hope that it kind of becomes less of a weird thing. I hope more people embrace it, because even within my own family and my own friend groups back home, there is a certain need still to fit into some sort of category or subcategory of, oh, you're feminine, oh, you're masculine, or whatever. And it feels like you need almost a certain identity if you're gonna dress like that, which you really don't need. I mean, I personally identify as, gender fluid, so obviously this makes me comfortable. But, I hope it becomes more widely accepted. I hope clothing stores start to sell more gender neutral stuff so that, people like me can, shop for things they really like and not get clothes every 3 years because they can never find anything they like.
I've noticed from hearing from my friends and my partner that it's quite difficult if you were assigned male at birth to access gender neutral fashion, because there's a lot of fashion that's made specifically for people who are assigned male, who identify as butch or trans. There are quite a few lines that specifically make clothing for that type of body. So I can think of like Peau de Loup in Vancouver is one example, where they specifically make fashion tailored for assigned female people who present in a more masculine way. But I haven't come across any brands that do the reverse of that. So it would be great to see that become more mainstream, especially since in my experience, I've found that clothing made for men is often quite restricted in the color schemes and in the patterns that are available. So if you feel yourself to be a more androgynous or more feminine person, and yet you have a body that fits more comfortably in men's clothing, it can be really frustrating trying to get clothing that communicates your gender experience.
For me, being gender neutral is a fairly recent concept. I never knew I was, gender neutral until probably about 4 months ago. Before that, I didn't even really know that there was a term or that I could use it because I wasn't sure. So I'm gender fluid, but the way it goes for me is that I'm fine in the body that I'm in, which is a little bit more on the feminine side, but my energy is very masculine, which seems to confuse people.
Dressing androgynously has given me the ability to communicate how I see myself to others. I've never been a very feminine person, but for a long time I was dressing that way. And I often felt that people weren't really seeing me. They were seeing this image I put out of myself that was largely rooted in fear and worry about not fitting in. And now that I've embraced my gender queerness and really started to communicate that through clothing, it's given me so much confidence to make connections with people and know that they know about that aspect of myself right away, rather than feeling like it's something that they will learn about me as our relationship continues.
I identify as non-binary, and just this, for the past few years, ever since I came to that realization, it's been interesting to experiment with gender neutral fashion, because when I first realized I still had a lot of clothes that would be perceived more as generally feminine. But in the following years, my clothing style became more typically masculine, and now it's sort of reached something of a medium. I still prefer what would generally be considered masculine fashion, but I'm not as adverse to looking at women's clothes as I was in like the past year and a half, 2 years. So, I don't know. The journey to gender neutral fashion is never linear, or is rarely linear. I don't want to say never because I'm just going from my experience, but it hasn't been linear, and I don't anticipate that it will be linear in the future, and I think that's probably true for society as well.
We aim to serve people who identify as queer, people who like maybe don't necessarily identify as queer, but people who feel not that aligned with the fashion that serves female bodies. You know, you walk into a women's clothing store and you're like, there's nothing for me here. People who want to have a more masculine style of fashion, and who mainly maybe feel drawn towards men's fashion but aren't getting the fit that they want with men's clothing because it's made for a different type of body. A lot of genderless clothing ends up just being men's clothing, and so I think it's important to have a variety of stuff that's accessible for any gender who wants to wear those kinds of items.
It's for people like you and I who don't really fit into a box, and were looking for a product that matched what they felt in the inside to what they wanted to be on the outside.
We try to stay away from really gendered language, both on our website and in our social media, and just interacting with customers. Using gender neutral language is really important to us because we know that we have a broad customer base, not just women, not just queer people.
I leave the judgment at the door. I welcome every single person, whoever they are, whatever they want to be, or who they're becoming to be.
If there's not anything for you in either the women's section or the men's section, then we're going to try and fill that void.
It's not mainstream, so to sort of break into a market and carve sort of your own piece of the pie is really challenging. There's not a ton of funding out there, so when you're getting started, it's just a lot of red tape you kind of have to go through. Our world is still run by a lot of old men who don't quite get it. So there are quite a few brands now, maybe 10 or 20 of them, who are doing unique things, whether it's shirts, suits, ties, bow ties. There's a lot of different things, but still no big box retailer has really represented it. I know Selfridges in London was one of the first that had a section, but it's gone. It lasted for, I think, a season. Same with Simon's, local company. And Jen hit the nail on the head. When they say unisex or genderless clothing, it's just an oversized t-shirt with a graphic on it. It's not genderless clothing. I think there's still huge opportunities in the market to really break down those boundaries.
I think they just need a wider range of sizing and more inclusivity in, creating stuff that isn't necessarily like for women or for men.
I hope it's not really a thing. I hope it is. I hope, children don't have to have a coming out story. I hope it's, sort of the same thing. I just hope you go into a mall and just like you walk into a Gap, you walk into a store that's built for you. Because I think fashion plays a really big part in self-identity and self-confidence. I think it allows you to go out into the world a certain way, and if you don't see yourself and who you feel you are represented out there, it's a pretty lonely place.
as a member of the queer community with a lot of trans and non-binary friends, I would say we're more socially aware and in tune and active in a sense of like doing our part. So I think that comes into play sustainability wise, clothing wise, wanting to use resources that are already there as opposed to contributing to mass garbage. Between the shops, we don't call them by gender. We call the frock shop, which we say has more femme-forward clothing. We call it the frock shop. And then the shop on Hastings, we call the unisex shop. So we make sure all staff is aware to do that when people are inquiring about the different shops or what they can find, or if one only has women's clothes or whatever, so that we're being inclusive in that sense. And then when it comes to like categorizing it, we try to keep it fluid so people can just pick from wherever and not feel like they're in a section that's not for them. And I think definitely in like marketing and advertising, including more trans and non-binary folk in advertising, especially if big box companies could do that for inclusivity, for sure. I hope it goes so that everyone just feels comfortable doing what they want, wearing what they want.
Our society still has a long way to go when it comes to accepting people who don't necessarily fit in the, two binaries of our society, a man or a woman. And I really hope the world can come to, be more accepting and inclusive and respective of, people who are non-binary or gender fluid or gender neutral, and, the way that we dress or act or present ourselves.
The more data that we can get out there, I think the better. I mean, the data was so skewed in the past, where people who weren't going to, like what they call as paths or whatever, just weren't considered trans or transgender, and a non-binary transgender even just wasn't even heard of. So we don't really have a good idea of how many numbers there are. And there's a lot of people who remember that from their past and just are still afraid to come out, and they just don't know what they can come out as and what the options are.
It's a matter of what boundaries are you willing to push? What boundaries are there? How strictly are they enforced? Gender neutral fashion is going to continue to change and has always changed because gender neutral has changed.
As a greater global society, I think need to be open to blending the binary a little bit.
One of my favorite quotes, movie quotes growing up, to infinity and beyond.